Let me just adjust this. Okay. Hello, my name is Jacob Shabzin. Thank you all for being here today. I have a confession. Wanting to be an artist is a dead-end dream. In the system that I grew up in, many creatives were told from day one that money comes first and happiness comes second. As a photographer myself, I have known the struggle of being told what you're doing is just a hobby and having your work be relegated to economic obscurity. Unless you make some money first. Go be an economist and pay the bills, then you can live out your dream. Now, am I against this money first, arts later idea? Obviously not. Here I am presenting my honors economics thesis to you. But there is something to be said about how art and artists are viewed in economics. I believe there is reason to start viewing them as more than just producers of creative goods and services, but instead as a signal for something greater. Artists throughout history have tended to congregate geographically. Where an artist lives and works can give context to and even categorize the artist within their discipline. Periods in art are typically defined by both stylistic features as well as the places they develop. Movements across all artistic media, from the Italian Renaissance all the way to the Motown music of Detroit, were symbolic both creatively and geographically. These clusters attract demand for art, which in turn adds value to the economy. General economic theory of supply and demand can explain why artists creating work that is valuable to some group can have an impact on the economy as a whole, namely when that artwork enters the market. As the number of working artists increases, so will the amount of art being created, which eventually leads to the art being purchased or experienced by consumers. Artists also rely on an audience to share their work with, so finding the right people is important. So if art adds to the economy, can the artists themselves indicate this future growth? When these people are found and this niche growth inevitably begins to happen, how can we view it through the lens of an economist? Purely the product of a free market expanding? Or could the artists themselves be a precursor to overall growth for the place that they live? That brings us to my research question, which is as follows. Is artist residency a reliable indicator of economic growth? Previous economic literature has explored the relationship between arts and the economy solely through an economic lens. In this art and economy section, there are a few pivotal conclusions that have guided my research. Creatives tend to cluster in urban areas, which produce the largest percentages of gross domestic product, or GDP. GDP is defined as the monetary value of all goods and services created within a certain period of time within a certain place. Next, the presence of notable creatives has a significant positive correlation to the growth of a city's population. Correlation here meaning the coordinated movement of two factors in the same direction. In this case, positive correlation is found, but causal evidence has not yet been identified. My work will look to provide this evidence. And lastly, firms base themselves in areas with the highest numbers of creative and talented workers. On the applied theory of supply and demand, artists rely on the availability of an audience to consume their work, and economists are now viewing arts and culture as a valuable asset to an economy through conventional industries like tourism. Lastly, in the gentrification section, which could not be fully explored in this project, gentrification and art move hand in hand, so artists are directly impacting city development on a cultural level. This is still important to note as it relates closely to the idea stated in the first two sections of literature. After reviewing these previous works and using the theoretical framework described earlier, my hypothesis is as follows. If artist residency increases, demand for products and services produced by creatives will increase, leading to a rising supply of art and thus measurable economic growth on a citywide level. These are all the sources of data that I use in this project, starting with GDP and stratified GDP from only the arts and entertainment sector, derived from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. The Arts Vibrancy Index, or AVI, has only been around since 2015, and I was denied access to use most of the necessary data for this specific project. It is a survey that consists of 12 indices in 3 categories, those being number of arts providers, number of arts dollars, and government support for the arts. Each city receives a score based on these categories, and the report gives them a percentile ranking against all other cities measured. To alleviate the lack of data from the AVI report, I used a proxy variable of occupational data from the current population survey from IPUMS, which I turned into an artist per capita figure. Unfortunately, not every city had even reporting on these occupational figures, so a small number of observations are missing in the data for this important variable. I also used employment figures from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, like unemployment and total labor force, and average house prices from Zillow as a control. As we'll see momentarily, many of these figures had to be calculated into log form with my regression analysis in order to obtain more accurate results that could be more easily interpreted. This is a map of all the cities used in this data set. And as you can see, these locations are all around the US and are all large metropolitan statistical areas, or MSAs. Some were chosen based on repeat appearances in the Arts Vibrancy Index's top 20 communities, and others were chosen based on similar key characteristics like population size. The list includes large cities like the greater New York area and sunny Los Angeles, California, and some smaller yet arts vibrant places like Binghamton, New York, and Boulder, Colorado. There are, of course, many limitations to this project, but here are the 4 main issues that I have found. Lack of data. Without the AVI measures and full occupational data, there's enough missing to cause problems in regression analysis. The order of operations. Without knowing if growth comes before an increase in artist residency or vice versa, I am forced to choose which way the models will run only based on theory. This leads into the next limitation of endogeneity. This is when the explanatory variable, in this case GDP growth rate, is correlated with the error terms or controls in the regressions. This can lead to insignificant results with no real way of correcting them within the current data set. And finally, the time constraint. The amount of time that a city takes to grow and develop is not alike across every place, so data over time could not be chosen equally for each city. These are all the variables, as previously mentioned, shown here in their most standard forms. Some things to note. The variance of all observations is high in GDP and GDP growth percentage, as well as artists per capita. GDP from arts and entertainment only contributes about 4% of total GDP on average. GDP growth rates average about 3.67% year on year. The average artist per capita is about 7,600 for every 100,000 people in a city. And the average labor force, or total population that works for a city, is about 2.5 million. This histogram is a sample of one of the figures measured in the Arts Vibrancy Index that I was able to utilize for one model. The common thread through each location is that they are a major statistical area in terms of population, or they ranked highly on the AVI reports, which is why I believe the AVI measures are skewed towards the high end like this one. This could affect my results because there aren't enough instances of low scores to balance this scale, but these figures were only used for one model. Here are all of the models I used in my regressions. For each, the dependent variable is GDP growth percentage. The variable of interest is artists per capita, which again serves as a proxy to the AVI number of artists measure. Here, Z is a vector of control variables that includes unemployment rate, the log of average house price, and the log of the total labor force per observation. The second model, titled Stratified GDP, was intended to see whether or not there was a difference between predicting growth in the whole economy or just in the arts sector itself. In order to make sure the city itself had no effect on the outcome, I used a third city fixed effects model with the Great Recession as a quasi-experiment, as all cities were affected similarly during these years. As it says in the name, this model fixes each city's individual characteristics to avoid bias from the place itself. Lastly, the cross-section for AVI was used to see how 1 year of AVI data could potentially be useful if accessible in the future, and the year used was 2019. Here are my regression tables and results. Estimation 1 is the main model, 2 is stratified GDP, 3 is the city fixed effects with the year dummies during the Great Recession, which is 2007 to 2009, and the last model is the cross-section for AVI for the year 2019. The stars of statistical significance are indicated at the bottom of the tables, with 3 stars indicating a p-value less than 0.001. Most importantly, our main regression can be interpreted as every 10% artist per capita increases, it would lead to a 0.6% increase in GDP growth, with no stars of significance. This and the rest of the coefficients on this variable suggest that an increasing number of artists has some positive effect on GDP growth rate. It also follows my hypothesis that using artists as an indicator for growth is possible, just not at a meaningful or statistically significant level at this time. The unemployment rate coefficients are the only ones with any level of statistical significance, which could be explained by the direct link of the labor market to output in GDP in this case. In the first two cases, for every 1% increase in unemployment rate, the GDP growth rate will decrease by 0.52% and 0.58% respectively. The third coefficient, however, reads such that a 1% increase in unemployment rate would lead to a 0.19% decrease in growth rate during the Great Recession. A smaller effect in this case is expected because the economy as a whole was tumbling, regardless of factors like labor force participants and unemployment rate. The only coefficient that increased when this year restraint was applied was average house price, which was only higher by a slim, insignificant margin. The cross-sectional regression took three available AVI indices: number of arts providers, number of independent artists, and amount of government support for the arts, and regressed them against all controls previously used. In this case, for every 1 point increase in the AVI arts providers ranking, GDP growth increases by 0.04% with no level of significance. For the rest of the variables, each coefficient shows an extremely small negative effect on growth with no significance. What can we draw from these results? Artist residency has little to no effect on GDP growth. The controls also prove to have no major effect when regressed with the artist per capita figure, and a lack of relevant data over time is the main hindrance. After this research process, my suggestion is that gentrification should be the main mechanism for future studies. The question is, what data will be accessible? As an example, this could be the formula that leads neighborhoods through the process of gentrification for my study. Low rent would lead to an uptick in artist residency. The supply of art increases and demand would follow. The art becomes commercialized in the market. An area's output grows, a neighborhood's output grows, and eventually becomes financially stable. When you think of this model, think of Soho, Williamsburg, and the East Village. These are examples close to our hearts that can act as a proof of concept for this mechanism having a positive effect on growth and could potentially act as models for places that are at the early stages of gentrification. Data currently available is not sufficient for this analysis, however. It needs to be thoroughly stratified geographically. To identify where gentrification is happening is often difficult to quantify, but things like housing prices can be a solid indicator of neighborhoods about to turn over. The data needs to be at the neighborhood level, though, as we know that examples above are very niche communities that would be meshed together in typical data collection. Without this, the research will not be significant. Unfortunately, no policy ideas can be recommended with these insignificant results. This analysis has never been done viewing arts as a precursor for growth in the economic discipline, and future research requires more data over more time, specifically at the city level. Growth and development don't happen overnight, and the year range for almost all of these cities has not seen them change or develop drastically. There is more work to be done here, as this is a very complex topic with a lot of discipline crossover. With more time and eventually more data, this question and many others like it should hopefully have more conclusive answers in the coming years. As an artist myself, it would have been great to see a coefficient proving my economic worth to everybody else. But as we've been doing for all of human history, the artists will just have to show you their value through their work. Thank you.
Great job. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Advisor gets first question.
Sure. Can you, my favorite thing to do is look at the regression slides. I think something you need to consider as a control is population, because I know that you may want to consider, there are different varying sizes of these cities, and, a difference between a city that has 500,000 to a city that has 20 million is quite large. So I think that would be an important control to include in this.
Yep.
And other kind of city characteristics that particularly might be important for attracting artists to come into their city, into the city. That's kind of the main comment I have here. And then can you go back to the slide with the map
Yes.
and talk a little bit more about why those cities, and which ones are your kind of, if you're thinking about control and treatment, which we're often trying to do to get more causal estimates as best we can. And with this endogeny, I recognize, that is very hard to do. Tell me a little bit more about that selection of cities.
Right. So most of the cities that I initially selected were selected based on intuition, but also based on the Arts Vibrancy Index rankings. Going through the 5 reports that have come out thus far in the report's history, most of these cities were repeat offenders. In terms of larger cities like New York and Los Angeles, those in our minds are obviously places where artists congregate and what you think of when you think of an artist populated city, but it was also proven by that data. Cities that acted as controls in terms of having lower arts vibrancy numbers, but similar other city characteristics, mainly population, were most of the Texas cities, actually all 3, actually except for Austin. Houston and Dallas were both equal or close to equal in terms of average population, but their arts vibrancy numbers were lower on average. So those cities were some of the examples. There are also others, like Santa Fe, New Mexico, ranked very highly, but had a small population. So there is some variance, but Dallas and Houston were those 2, and also Detroit were all put in there as controls that didn't rank super highly in AVI. They still ranked somewhat highly because their populations were so high, and they're a city, which attracts more than a more rural place that wouldn't be as arts vibrant. But some of those cities include, Dallas, Houston, and Detroit really were the closest controls I could get that were similar to the arts vibrant cities that I was using.
Great, thank you very much. Those are my questions.
Thank you. Anna?
Hi, my apologies for my camera. I'm on my laptop. I don't know why my camera is not working, so my apologies that I'm not in the video. But Jacob, hi, Jacob.
Hi.
Jacob, I have to tell you that I'm very pleased to see such unique idea to be materialized. That initially I was skeptical when you and I had that first conversation about it, but I'm glad that you persisted, and it really came out quite with interesting results, even though not significant. You were very well able to explain why not. And I really like that idea, that it's okay not to get the results that you expect to have, but if you are able to explain them, that's great. And I think that's exactly what is happening here. I also am very happy to see that you were able to combine your passion, 2 of your passions, one for art and one for economics in this project. And this is terrific, really. My question is, I know you were talking about the lack of data, but do you feel that the results also could be different for different time periods? Perhaps that whole situation was different during the Industrial Revolution. Maybe it was different in the beginning of the 20th century and different from the end of the 20th century. And today it would be very different. Would you expect to have this difference, and what kind of difference?
I would expect the results to be different depending on the time period. Like I said in some of the conclusion slides, cities don't grow overnight, and cities don't all grow at the same time. In terms of something like the Industrial Revolution, yes, there was that would be a great period to look at. that was my initial thought when I started this process. Unfortunately, the data that I had chosen to use was not available, or at least readily available as a student to access to do these sorts of regressions during that time period. So I would expect different results. When you talk about city development, and I'm no expert on this, but from what I know and from what I see, living in a city and just existing, things don't happen overnight, and cities grow at different paces and for different reasons. When you think of a person from a city, let's say you think of someone from Los Angeles and someone from New York, you can picture artists in both of those places. You most likely have a different picture of the person in your head. Whether or not there's statistical evidence for that is besides the point. Cities are different, and different groups of people differ culturally. So determining how each city grows at the same time in the same time period is difficult to analyze. But I would expect different results, and most likely better ones, if I was able to use like periods of art growth, like for example, the abstract expressionism movement in the 1940s in New York. If I had enough data over enough time to really see, like, as a quasi experiment, as one city grows, and to be able to analyze that, I think would be more significant than viewing all the cities at the same time. This is sort of just the baseline, though,
Right.
for this question. And this was fortunately the easiest way and the most accessible way to do it with the time period that I had. But yes, I would expect different results.
Yeah, it's an exciting, really exciting topic. You could go into depths with it, really.
Right. Thank you.
Depending on data. Yep.
Other questions? I like this because you read my mind, where you don't have these statistically significant results, but we all know that what you're saying is true. Like, as somebody who lived in Williamsburg in 2004, like following the artists across, and then they all moved to Bushwick and everybody just keeps moving east. And it's like, we know that it happens. And so how do you find enough data? I did want to ask, why can't you get the AVI data? Are they just not sharing, or is it paywall?
I had reached out to them to access so I have access to the reports, which, like I said, they list the top 20 communities every year. And then I think they list either 10 to 15 of the top small communities. But over the years, those small communities vary. So I didn't have consistent data on like enough cities to be significant. And also, they don't give the full rankings for each city. They just give a couple of the numbers in the report itself. Each year they put out like an interactive map where you can go to each different city and see how it ranked in each individual index and everything. But that map goes away when the new year's report comes out. So the only individual data I had access to as a consumer of the data was just the last year, which was data from 2019. The report came out in 2020. When I requested access to the either aggregated data or disaggregated data to use in this analysis, I was denied. So that's why it wasn't used. But thankfully, I had the artist per capita figure to at least use for one of those AVI indexes that I couldn't access.
That's not very nice of them.
No, it's not. But I wasn't surprised.
It's not collegial. Like, often somebody saying, "Oh, I have a thesis. Can I get this data?" And they're like, "Yeah, sure."
Maybe I thought I asked politely. Maybe I didn't. Maybe I,
sure you did.
maybe I emailed someone on the wrong day and they weren't having, I don't know, something. But
Maybe
yeah,
they wanted you to pay for the data.
Yeah, it's probably capitalism.
I'm certain. Yeah, that was my first guess, was that there was some sort of paywall that I wasn't even allowed to access. They didn't even offer me to. Maybe I would have paid. I don't know. It would have been good, but.
Well, they probably sell that data to publishers who do their best cities to live in every year, like,
yeah,
and they use it for that kind of proprietary information.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Family and friends are welcome to also ask questions or make comments.
Jacob, are your parents here?
They are indeed, yes.
I wanted to say that this is terrific, and I wanted to thank them for raising such a wonderful student for us. And we really enjoyed having you here. We are definitely going to miss you when you graduate.
That's really nice to hear.
Thank you. Thank you. It was such a pleasure to have him as a student. Absolute pleasure.
I agree. I'm also very glad that you stuck with this topic because it is something that is very interesting, and it did require creativity and really, perseverance to try and find answers to it, which, you could have found something that, all of the data was in iPhones and you just did something, but you chose something that you were passionate about. And I appreciate that.
Most important. Absolutely agree.
Any final questions? Okay, well then let's encourage everyone to turn their cameras on so that we can get a gallery shot for posterity. I'm going to turn.
Oh, Jacob, can you stop sharing your screen?